Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Pastor Lacy and Miss Sue, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all this morning about our passion for people at North Highland Church. My name is Stacy Lacy, and I'm the Connections Director at North Highland Church. I'm also Pastor Brad's wife, for any of you who know him. And my job here is to connect people with the church. It is where our passion for people gets walked out. And so today I will be talking about our passion for people. Now, growing up, I didn't really have a strong church family. When I was 10, we switched churches, and then a few years after that, my family experienced some really deep church hurt. And it greatly influenced my thoughts and my feelings about the church. And then after Brad and I got married, we lived in a really small town in Statesboro, and we went to a really small church, and some of those people were really mean. And we never really felt like we had a good, encouraging set of believers that we could be in community with. And so really for the first 30 years of my life, I did not have a strong church community, and that's kind of how church looked for me. So Brad and I came to North Highland about 9 years ago, and I was a little nervous to be around people in the church. I'd been hurt, and I was just waiting for that to happen again. But can I just say that this church is awesome? I love being part of this community. If you love our church, go ahead and put some things in the chat about how awesome our church is. Whether it's a little clap emoji, a heart emoji, whatever. We got to give our church some love because it is amazing. And I know our church isn't perfect. We are filled with imperfect people, including myself, who've said or done hurtful things. But our community here overall does a really great job at building community. And there's a passion for people here that really is unmatched. The Bible itself shows us that God has this amazing passion for people. He created us. He has a passion for us to live in community with each other, and it is evident from the very beginning of the Bible. Community and dealing with people is probably the hardest thing that God has to do. He has to deal with our sin, our pain, our questioning, and a lot of times that will influence the community around us. We don't sin and have pain and ask questions in a vacuum. It truly does affect our community. God created us for community, but He also knows that being in community is not an easy or seamless process for humans. I love the fact that Jesus was human. He realized how annoying we can be sometimes. He realizes we can get angry, we get grumpy when we're tired or hungry, we get jealous, we get annoyed, we act aloof. We always act inconsistently. And yet God is consistent. He is unchanging, He is consistent. So here is humanity, this inconsistent creation that sins, experiences pain, has questions. And we do this in groups, and what we do in groups affects those around us. And God is consistent and unchanging, and so that is why it's so important. Jesus understands our inconsistencies, and He knows that sometimes we need to stop ourselves and become more like God, consistently loving people. Our Sunday school class recently was doing some studies in the book of the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul, and I really spent some time digging deep into their lives. For those of you who may not know their stories, I'm going to share some of them today. And I looked at these two biblical figures and realized that without these two very different men, the Bible and church as we know it today would not exist. First off, we're going to talk about Peter. Now, Peter has this beautiful story arc. He spread the gospel. He established the early church, but he started off as like this scared, forlorn character, ends up becoming this wonderful preacher of the gospel. He was a fisherman from a small town in business with his brother, and Jesus physically called him to follow. For 3 years, Peter lived day in and day out with Jesus. Peter was part of this community around him, and Jesus was the center of that community. Jesus called Peter out on his sin, healed his inner pain, and didn't mind answering Peter's questions. Jesus is the ultimate person to have in your community. I mean, really, if you look at the Bible, He was firm and fun. He was kind yet cutting. But He was exactly what Peter and the other disciples needed at the moment they needed it. Jesus was the representation of Yahweh, I am on earth. He was what every disciple needed in the moment they needed it, exactly how they needed it to be done. And after Jesus ascended back into heaven, the disciple group was still together, and they had even added people to their group. They ate together, they shared together, they lived together, they prayed together. They lived a life in a very close-knit community with each other. They dealt with each other's sins and pain and questions. And in fact, in Acts 4, it states that there was an apostle called Barnabas, which means a person who encourages. And he had some land, and he even sold it and turned the money over to the apostles. So they are sharing everything with each other. And when we look at Peter's life as a Christ follower, he had this very consistent community, and he had almost grown up with the people in his community. Even his brother Andrew was in it. So they dealt with each other's sins and pains and questions all together. And the life of Peter reminds me of those of us who have grown up in the church or who have known Christ for a really long time. We have this great community. We know the lingo, we know the expectations, we have experienced Jesus, and we want to continue to grow with our community. How many of you can identify with Peter's type of life? Go ahead and put in the chats, I can identify with Peter. Maybe you've grown up in a community of believers, maybe at this exact church. You realize how important it is to have someone to meet with you about your sin, pain, and questions, and encourage you to keep going in this important community. Now, remember, we're also talking about Paul. So here's Paul, who originally was called Saul. Eventually, he was going to take the gospel to all the non-Jewish people, and he wrote letters and documents that basically makes up most of our New Testament. Paul did not walk face to face with Jesus on the earth. He was actually a Jewish religious leader, and actually, he was persecuting Christians and killing them when we first meet him in the Bible. He had had a very dramatic experience with Jesus that changed his life. And he had experienced this transformation to start living for Jesus by himself. Now, there were other people around him, but they didn't see what he saw and they didn't experience what he experienced. He went blind for a few days, and after this experience, he did have a few people helping lead him around and feed him. But then he moved on to another place. And so Paul has this dramatic conversion, and he has lost the only community that he had ever known with the religious leaders, and he is left alone. Paul didn't have anyone in community with him. No one was there to talk through his sin. No one was there to be forgiving of his sin. Didn't have anyone to empathize with his pain, and the questions he had about Jesus couldn't be answered by anyone in the community he had been living in. When Paul had his conversion, he was left with no community. He's been persecuting the church, so the people in the early church are not necessarily going to be super excited about inviting him over to their house. And the religious leaders can't really have anything to do with him anymore because he's kind of defeated their mission of killing Christians and putting them in jail. So Paul is in this place where he doesn't really have anyone, and he's lost his community. So how many of you out there can identify with Paul's type of life? Maybe put a little Paul in the chat. Maybe you've recently moved to Columbus, had a radical life transformation, a major life event that left you reeling, and you don't have anyone that you can really turn to when dealing with your pain, sins, questions about God or Christianity. You feel like you want to settle down here and be part of a community, but you need a bridge to the community. So let's look at this growth of the first century church. Yes, we had Peter, this disciple of Jesus. He was in close community. And we have Paul, who was converted to Christianity, shunned from his community. And it took both of these men, it took Peter and it took Paul, it took both of them to develop the first century church. A lot of times we think it's about these men and their work that was essential to the first century church. And it was about these men and their obedience to God. However, there is someone else in the story who was essential to their ministry. And we're going to turn over to Acts 9. So if you want to go ahead and get your Bible and turn with me there. Let me give a little bit of history. Jesus has lived, died, resurrected, ascended back into heaven. The original disciple group has amassed followers and are growing the church, and they are met with persecution from the Jewish religious leaders. And when I say persecution, I'm actually meaning stoned to death. Okay, yikes. So the disciples in early church are a little freaked out by the thought of being stoned to death, rightly so. And Acts 9, if you go back and start at the beginning, it will give you the complete story of Saul's transformation to Paul. And in one day, he dramatically goes from Christian killer to Christ follower. And so in a day or a few days, there's the believers in the city where he has ended up, Damascus, are a little confused. They're like, help? I'm a little confused. Wasn't this the guy who was just coming here to destroy us, imprison us, kill us? I'm not really sure I can trust him. This kind of reminds me of if you've ever been around a toddler and you tell them they can't have something and they kind of go into their temper tantrums and scream and kick. I'm speaking from personal experience. And then like you go into the freezer to maybe pull out some meat for dinner that night. And as soon as they hear the freezer door open, they pop up, wipe their tears away and go, I'm sorry, Mom, can I have a popsicle? It's kind of what the believers in Damascus felt about Paul. Like he's down here acting like an animal, kind of crazy towards them. And then all of a sudden he's just become their friend. It's a little unsettling for them. So further down even, we see that the Jewish leaders were confused. So this community that Paul was trying to be a part of was like, back it up, bro. And then the Jewish leaders, the community he had been a part of, were like, no, that's not going to work. And they were actually trying to kill him, to murder him. So people in the city are going from saying, I don't know if I can really trust him, to let's just go ahead and kill this guy. I mean, it escalated real quickly there, real quickly. Paul finally leaves that place and goes back to Jerusalem where the main body of Christians was. And he's kind of expecting at least a warm welcome. I mean, he is serving Jesus now, right? Well, there's all this distrust and murder plots and all around escalation that he's kind of left behind. And we're going to start our reading in Acts 9, verse 26. And it says, after Saul arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but everyone was afraid of him. Still, everyone. They wouldn't believe that he was a disciple. And honestly, I can't really blame the disciples at this point, even though the Damascus believers had finally trusted him after a good amount of time. Paul had come to a new city where there was a new group of believers. And remember, there was no internet. There was no Instagram or Facebook to keep up with people. I mean, there wasn't even a newspaper or snail mail, Pony Express. There was no Morse code. I mean, there was no way for someone to hear about someone's transformation. Paul's reputation definitely preceded him, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing. So it goes on to say in the next verse, verse 27, then Barnabas took an interest in Saul and brought him to the apostles. And I love that phrase. Barnabas took an interest in Saul. What does that mean? One version I read said it took him under his wing. Barnabas took Saul or Paul under his wing. But I went back to the original Greek, and even though I cannot speak Greek, I kind of found the phrase what it means, and it says to take hold of and help someone when they have an injury or when they're in peril. Help someone out when something is said by that person that could be turned against them. And so for me, Barnabas is coming up and he's saying, and it even says, continues in verse 27, Barnabas told the apostles how Saul had seen the Lord on the road and that the Lord had spoken to him, and told them how boldly Saul had spoken about Jesus in the city of Damascus. And so it's really amazing if you think about it. Barnabas did more than just say, I'm kind of interested in him. He's cool. He seems like a cool guy. He essentially went to Paul, put his arm around him and said, hey guys, don't hold his old life against him anymore. He's a new creation and we're going to welcome him into our community. He was essentially like a mother bird protecting his little chick, saying, no, we're not going to let the past define Paul. We're going to look at what he's done and we're going to take that. And Paul was bridged into a community of new believers because of Barnabas. And so here we have these two men. We have Peter, who lived in community with Jesus day to day. He was healthy, growing, and flourishing. And we have Paul, also loved Jesus, but he lacked that Christian community. But they both needed a Barnabas. Barnabas blessed and encouraged Peter's community and bridged the gap for Paul to join a community. They both needed a Barnabas. And what does this have to do with us? Well, we're humans. We have sin, we have pain, we have questions, and we need a place to work through these things with other believers in community. Some of you, like Peter, have a community, but it's needing to kind of expand and flourish. You need a Barnabas to bless and encourage you in your community. Some of you are like Paul. You may feel like you're not really part of a community. Either you've recently decided to follow Jesus, you recently moved, you're in a new life season, whatever it is, you feel alone and you need a Barnabas to bridge you to community. The great thing today is we have a group of people in our church who want to be that Barnabas. They want to bless, encourage you, bridge you to your community. And the Barnabases in our church are our Connect group hosts. They are going to bless, encourage, help you cross obstacles in your life, and they'll help you no matter what you're going through. Whether you identify more with Peter and need encouragement in a community, or you identify with Paul and need to be connected into the community, everyone needs a Barnabas. Everyone needs a community. Now remember, Peter needed a Barnabas because he had this amazing community, but even Peter had a major crisis of faith. He denied Jesus. And Peter physically walked with Jesus, but he still needed a Barnabas. Barnabas was there to encourage him through that and take him to his next level in faith. That's a lot of Christians today, saved in a community, but just need to deepen their sense of community. Paul needed a Barnabas. He didn't have a strong community, and he was trying to do his faith walk on his own. He wasn't part of Jesus's original discipleship group, but Barnabas became that bridge that Paul needed to get to his community. So everyone needs a Barnabas, and everyone needs a community. In just a few minutes, we're going to be finishing this service, and we are going to be dropping a QR code in the chat right now of a list of all of our Connect groups. There's a bunch of different groups. We have groups on different days and times. We have groups that are age-specific, gender-specific, similar life situations. They're based on books. They meet on Sunday morning or Wednesday nights, Tuesday evenings, all different times. There's group for prayer. There's groups on Zoom and in person. There is a place for you to find community. Before we go, I want to share just one more story about why this is so important to me. 9 years ago when we came to this church, I had never had true community at my church. I identified with Paul. But when we got here, I knew I had to join a community, but I needed a Barnabas to bridge me to that community. I knew that if I wanted to grow and flourish and be encouraged, I had to find my Barnabas and I had to find my group. So I started going to a Connect group on Sunday mornings, and after a little while, I started opening up and being honest with myself. My walls started to come down. I started to learn insights about scripture I'd never heard before. I matured in my faith, and I received a greater understanding of God's ultimate plan for my life. And I started to realize that community was the key to deepening my Christian walk. I had found a community that would pray with me, encourage me, and bless me beyond what I ever thought or imagined could be. I was connected, and it has literally made a difference in my Christian walk. I wouldn't be here where I am today without that community. And what I learned about myself and God has completely transformed me. This is what I want you to do today. I want you to find a community where you can grow and be encouraged. And if you've never formed a relationship with Jesus, the best place to do that is in a community. You pray, you ask Jesus to come into your life, and then you find a community of believers who can walk you through whatever you're going through. For the rest of you who are believers, you need a community, just like Peter did. And whether you've been part of our church for 3 months or 3 decades, you cannot live your Christian life to the fullest apart from people. Don't go 3 months or 30 more years without knowing what a church community is all about. If you want to get connected to what is going on at North Highland, today is your day.
Hey, what's up, North Highland? It's Pastor Clayton here, and we are so thankful that you chose to watch this message today. We'd love for you to like it, comment on it, share it with a friend, and subscribe to this channel today. Man, there are so many different ways that you can keep up with us on all of our social media platforms, on our website. It's because of what you do that we're able to do what we do. So thanks so much for being a part of our online community, and we'll see you soon.